Welcome back. Today we're going to wrap up our KZ trio with the Flagship ASX. This is the 10 BA per side, BA only IEM. Previously I talked about the SA08, which is the wireless version, which was a 4 per side. Then the ASF, which is the 5 per side, and this is the Flagship 10 per side. So you can't actually see all 10. You can see if the 4 right there, and then this is the little guide, and then the little crossover, and there are some words that are hard to make out. I don't remember what it says. 20 BA work together or something like that. So that is what it looks like. These are not the stock tips. These actually are my ASLA Sedna ear fits. I like these better than the stock that come with it, because the ones that come with it are quite shallow, and I just don't really get along with them all that well. So this one came from the AK Audio Store, and they are having their Black Friday sale. So it says $97, but they have a coupon for $10 off, so it's about $87. If you have coupons in your account, it's going to be a little cheaper as well. So much like the ASF, I was using, this is the KB Ear Limpid, regular Limpid 4-core cable, the pure silver, and this is the Q-Deluxe 5K that I use just to give it a little more juice, which I think sounds much better than just using it in dongle mode, which I actually don't like the sound of, kind of very similar to the ASF. I just think it sounds a little better or a lot better with a little more juice. So this, like I said, this is the ASX, 10 BAs per side. This is the Flagship, and if you listen to the other two, like I have, it's the one that sounds like the Flagship. And most notably, I should have done this one first, because it's, at this point, my excitement is waning a little bit, because you start with the SA08 and it sounds pretty good, but there's some problems with it. And then you get to the ASF and you're like, oh, well, it's fixing all those problems. And here's a couple more problems. And then you get to the ASX and sort of all the problems are mostly solved. But it would have been, at this point, I'm sort of tired with the KZ trio. So I should have started with the Flagship first. So like I said, there's still a couple problems with the ASX, and mostly it's this bass level, and it really helps if you change the tips. I would definitely. I mean, some people may like that little extra bass, but it adds a bunch of warmth to the whole signature, which is actually quite nice. But if you're buying 10 BAs, it's the one thing that feels not quite right with that high driver count. You don't really need that much, so I do prefer these tips because they give you a bit more control, and the tuning on the ASX changed a little bit, tiny bit from the ASF, and I swear that the bass is just a little tighter, a little more controlled, and that may just because there's more drivers involved or whatever, or maybe it's just the shape. It's a tiny bit better, but I think it's you're still going to have that. People say it's got too much bass, and I sort of agree with that. Still needs amping as well, just like the ASF. And while it may say it's easy to drive, I think it's a little harder to drive than what it appears. So in general, from the ASF, if you're wondering which to buy, my initial thought was go buy the ASF, because it was going to get you 90 to 95% of what the ASX is. But the original prices, I think it was 50 and 90 or so. So you're basically saving yourself about 50% by going with the ASF. But, ultimately it comes down to details. If details are your priority, you're going to have to go with the ASX. This kind of warm, not overly sharpened signature doesn't lend itself to a super detailed presentation. It's definitely more musical, and the ASX sort of bridges that gap yet again, and it's not a cool presentation, but it's not as warm as the ASF. So there's more detail, much more finer details, and it almost forces you to go to the flagship model as opposed to the ASF, which sounds great, but if you're buying a high driver count BA, you're probably in the mood for a bunch of details, and the ASX is the one that delivers that. So finer details, closer to being there, and there's just this extra added texture, just tiny edge details and all the sounds that everything sounds just a little bit more realistic, like you're actually there, and you kind of immediately hear it. Something like REM's Drive, just those simple notes and his voice and all the tiny reverberations and the decay, all these things just sound like you would expect on a high driver count BA. So it's still the same warmish V shape, but just cleaner, better imaging, better details. Everything is slightly better than the ASF. And of course, you have to pay for it, but I will say that it's not like the ZSN Pro and the Pro X where they're just slightly different and you're really squinting to find the details. There's quite a bit of difference with the ASF and the ASX. So if you were thinking of saving some dollars, that's fine. Just realize that it's not going to quite be the detailed presentation that you were expecting. But, you got to be realistic. It's 5 BAs per side versus 10 BAs per side, and the ZAX split the difference, right? That was 8 per side. So it's still, the ASF is still under the ZAX. The ZAX sounds great, especially when amped, and then you get a couple more BAs with the ASX, and you just get a bit more detail. So yeah, the ZAX is probably the one that split the difference. Price-wise, is about the same as the ASF as well. So the bass, like I said, still a bit too much. If you listen closely, it'll rumble a little bit, but it's BA bass, so don't expect it to rumble all that much. But I just never got the feeling, because mostly it's the bass is bumped a little bit. You just never get the feeling that even the mid bass, when it hits hard, it has nice weight to it. There's a nice thump to it. It just never feels. It's at some point you sort of forget that there's actually a BA bass in there because it does that part of it so well. And yeah, when you go to songs that should really rumble, they're just not going to rumble on a BA. But as far as that weightiness of a kick drum, it's really quite there, and it's kind of surprising how good it does it. And that, I think, it's just part of this signature of just adding enough bass so you never really think about it missing, and plus giving it enough weight across the mid-range so you never feel like it's a BA dry analytical sound. So bass still a bit too much. I would still use tips to bring it down a little bit, but it does feel just a little bit more controlled, a little bit less than the ASF. Not by much. It's probably in my head, but it feels a little better than the ASF by a small margin. So the mids, so I think the mids actually dropped a little bit from the ASF level, and then from the SA08 level as well. So the SA08 started out with these very forward mids. The ASF brought them back a little bit. It's kind of more natural, but still a bit forward. And then I think the ASX kind of dropped them back a little bit more, and it's probably even more natural. But for me, they just became more in focus. All these tiny details, that little reverberation in the edges of voices and textures, and all that stuff just brings a lot of clarity and detail to notes and voices. And I think even though it feels a little bit, it's relatively back from the ASF, it's probably not all that, in the grand scheme of things, it's not really recessed. And by doing that, I think you just got a bunch more clarity. And it immediately, instead of getting caught up on someone's voice like you do on the ASF, you really start noticing the decay on notes and textures on voices. It's not a much different listening experience, but there's more to take in than when I said there was sort of missing details in ASF. It's those types of really small things that you're paying a lot of money for. So treble still a bit under level wise. It doesn't necessarily bother me because I'm not a huge treble head, but it's still very polite. And I think early on people were talking about the cymbals really being missing from tracks, and I don't really think they're missing. They're just kind of at a lower level. They don't pop out, but maybe they don't have that impact that some people were really expecting from such a high driver count. IEM, and I'll sort of agree with that. But when you look at the graph and it started to roll off at 6K, and people said, yeah, there's this huge chunk of frequency missing. You can't hear anything above 6K. I didn't really agree with that as much as perhaps that level isn't as high as it really should be, but it still stays quite polite. It still works for EDM. It works just in general. All three of these BA only sets from KZ, they're really flexible on music genres and playlists, and it's quite hard to find music for me that just didn't work on them. Whether it was EDM, acoustic, classic rock, it just had this really capable tuning that just worked across a ton of different music genres for me anyway. So staging, it's really similar to the ASF. They both have this natural wide. Vocals are still kind of high. It creates a lot of space on the soundstage. And sort of this all started with the SA08, which had these sticky sides where instruments really got plastered to the sides. You had this big open space for the vocals in the middle. It's a really nice vocal image, but then sometimes the instruments were kind of locked to your ears and you were missing sort of this encompassing soundstage. And the ASF did a better job of that, and it was just kind of the occasional stickiness to your ears. And the ASX is kind of similar. In general, the imaging and the position of instruments is actually slightly better than the ASF, but occasionally you still get this, a lot of instruments congregating in your ears. It is what it is. It's not my most favorite soundstage. I think I actually like the ZAX a little better, but it's just kind of a nitpick. One of those items that I'll notice, but it doesn't necessarily bother me. So that's about it. It is the KZ ASX. It is the flagship. It is the one. If you care about details, if you have the budget, you should probably skip over the ASF. It's kind of there, and if you're just a more musical person, it would probably be fine for you. If you're buying a high driver count, you want those fine details on notes and voices, then you're gonna have to find an ASX on sale. I wouldn't necessarily pay $90 for it, but do watch out for sales on AliExpress. Message your favorite stores like AK Audio Store, and they'll either tell you there's a promotion or not a promotion. But that's it. Thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you next time.